Thank you all for joining us. As he introduced, I am Nikki Maurer, and I am the Associate Principal at Normal Community High School. And with me is...
Hi there, Angie Codron. I'm the Associate Principal at Normal West High School, and we are in McLean County Unit 5 School District. And some of you might be saying to yourself, how did we get to do this Ed Leaders Network webinar? We're kind of saying that ourselves. And so I am also on the IPA Board of Directors. And Jason Leahy, the executive director of that board, comes and visits all the schools of all of the board members. And when he was here, we were talking through some virtual programming that we use in our district. And he said, you have to share this. And then within seconds, we were connected to Arlen, who's running this today. And then here we are today setting this up and presenting. And so we hope today, after Nikki and I share what we've been working on for 4 or 5 years in our district about all that we've learned for virtual programming and online programming, and are probably, what we talked about, more thankful now than ever that we had this in place 4 years ago. Even with the year that we had last year, we're not sure what that year would have looked like without all of the things that we already had in place for homebound, medical PE, initial credit, maybe with a rare schedule conflict, our multi-tiered system of supports, team decisions, an IEP team decision, credit recovery. And so those are kind of all of the things that we're going to talk about today. And we're super happy to be able to share that with everybody so that you don't have to start from scratch. And so today we're going to be talking about 3 areas. And so the target today is, what is your virtual program going to look like? And so we're going to share some things that we've learned about planning, about protocol, and about procedures. And then also we thought it was relevant as we have some information about what our fall 2021 will look like here in Unit 5. And so we wanted to share that as well, as everyone kind of plans for what that might look like in just a couple months. And so our target today is, again, you're going to plan your virtual program, what it's going to look like. And then at the end of each area, we'll have a time for questions. And so when we get to the end of planning, we'll stop. Arlen has assured us he'll be able to see the chat. We'll be able to hear the questions. You'll also be able to raise your hand and ask questions. That way it kind of breaks up the presentation 2 by part. So Maurer is going to take it away, and she's going to start with planning.
Okay, so as Angie mentioned, please understand that this has evolved over the span of about 4.5, 5 years for a variety of different reasons. And so we are going to share a lot of information with you, and you might really just be picking and choosing different pieces of this that will work for whatever you are looking for. So you might not need all of it, but we're going to share everything we've learned through that process over the last several years. All right, so first of all, we use the platform Edmentum. It has changed names 8 million times. It used to be Play-Doh, but what it is currently called is called Edmentum. And as you can now see on your screen, we have a lot of different courses through Edmentum that we can offer. And actually the list that you're looking at is not even everything that's available. There are different catalogs that company offers, and for all different grade levels. I saw in the chat that we have people all the way from elementary through high school and even into college. And so there are various different catalogs that you can purchase and use through this. And I believe there are other programs out there similar to Edmentum, and so depending on what you're looking for, it's there. And also just to mention, I think this presentation will be shared with you, and all of the different documents and items that we're showing to you will be available to you to copy and download as you need through the links that are active in the presentation, just like this list of courses.
Right. So we're not going to click on every link here to open the complete thing. So what we have is a quick screenshot of everything. And then when this is shared with you, or if you have any follow-up questions after and you want to contact us, then we'll be happy to follow up with the actual documents and things if anything sounds appealing to you once we explain everything. So step 1, as Maurer mentioned, is picking your online platform. What are you going to use?
And we do have Heartland Community College listed on there as well, because we have a partnership with them. So that would kind of depend on your area, whether or not you had some other options than just a specific platform like Edmentum as well. We also do use Illinois Virtual School for some things. That just comes at an additional cost for our families. So we try to use that as sparingly as possible and only really for courses that are not offered in the other platforms that we have. Okay, moving on, we do have what we call our virtual program booklet. This is another example of something that has evolved. Every year we've made changes to this. It is basically the first step in planning for any given student and their scenario. Angie kind of hinted earlier that this really started when we had some homebound students and some students with medical exemptions pre-COVID, that we needed options for, because courses in their schedule were not applicable in the homebound setting. You know, if you think of certain things that were, I mean, even difficult during COVID, like ceramics and sculpture, some of our cooking classes that were really difficult to do, we were trying to supplement that for our students with these virtual classes. And so we use this booklet in order to make sure that we are meeting the individual needs of each student, that we are working towards building the courses that they need. And usually this is filled out through a collaboration between the student's counselor, school counselor, and either Angie or myself, or another administrator, depending on the situation, whether it's a homebound situation, a 504, an IEP, there might be a case manager involved in that as well.
Right. And so this booklet is used for a student that would be on a full virtual school program, typically. So we have like 8 hours in the day. So a student would need to take 6 classes to have a full caseload. And so this is special approval for a student to be full virtual programming for our district.
Okay, and then we also have a process, and this would depend on your district's policy, but our district has a very specific board policy related to how many credits students can earn outside of our school buildings, and how many of those credits can be attributed to each semester of our year. And so this form we created to make sure that we are attributing the correct credit that they should be getting for the courses that they are replacing with virtual classes. So for instance, perhaps they just need, I'll give you an example actually. So for next year, my consumer ed schedule is very strange because Angie and I are sharing a teacher across town who has to teach consumer ed. So it is locked into very specific periods of my master schedule. And so I had a handful of students who can't fit that because of either work program or something else that they have locked into their day. And so several of them will be taking consumer ed through our virtual class program. And so their counselor would fill out this form to get approval to put that class into their schedule instead of the butt in the seat in the class with the Unit 5 consumer ed teacher. You know, we have some other situations that we would use this for. I mean, as you can see on there, you know, homebound special ed. Angie mentioned our MTSS team. So we have a problem solving team that meets either once or twice a week, coming up with interventions for our students that are struggling. In place of PE situations, we've used it also. We've had students, for instance, who are pregnant and basically are on maternity leave, and we'll use that to supplement some of their courses that are difficult when they aren't in person. So a wide range that this option would be used for.
And so something that we had to consider here too when we initially started this, because this is probably 3 years ago or 4 years ago now, was you'll want to involve some conversations probably with your union, right? Because what you're doing is providing this option as initial credit. And so that's why there's a full, and you'll see this approval process later, but there's a full approval process for initial credit so that we're not outsourcing our teachers. That's not the point of this. This is why there's this special approval form that, like Maurer said, starts with the counselor, comes through to us, which we'll talk about a little bit later, goes to our district level for approval. And that was part of working with our union, just to make sure that we were focused that this was for initial credit, but we weren't bypassing and what happens in our classroom with our teachers. And so that was one component or a stakeholder that you'll want to think of if this is something that you're looking at doing.
Excellent. We both briefly mentioned our MTSS and problem solving process. And as you can see, these are all of the different tiers that are discussed in those meetings with that team. And one of the options that we are talking to you about either being the full day, which was the booklet that we shared first, or just the supplemental, anything from 1 to a handful of classes, are options that the support team can recommend. And so it's a really great option for, I'll give you an example, a student who is dealing with some issues with anxiety, and maybe making it through the full day here at school is causing areas of concern. And so maybe they either start or end their day with a virtual class or 2 in their schedule, so that gives them a break, or sometimes in the middle of the day to give themselves a break from the regular classroom. And so those referrals for this come straight from that team. So the team would make the decision that that's the intervention they're recommending. That discussion happens with the student and the parent to make sure that they're on board with that option. And then it links back to the forms that we showed you. So if it was for a full day, then the team and the counselor would fill out the full booklet. If it was just for a couple of classes, then they would fill out the supplemental form and move forward that way.
Another example of this is something that you could use for a whole math intervention. And so something we've used this for is if you have a group of students that your MTSS team has identified in first semester who have maybe failed algebra and need the support of moving back to the in-seat pre-algebra for second semester, we've enrolled a small group of students also into first semester pre-algebra, and then our MTSS math interventionist helps with those students that are in the in-seat pre-algebra, but also enrolled in this virtual course. And so we've used it not only for individual students, but also groups of students that are at a tier 2 level that need some kind of an intervention or support. And because we live at the secondary and live in credit recovery world, and credits and graduation and working toward that, we do have to be mindful of how that's being used as well.
Speaking of credit recovery. So that's actually how I would say that our first instance of this was probably with credit recovery, when that was first a thing, when in-person summer school kind of went by the wayside for a lot of districts because of the cost of it. And a lot of these companies were kind of coming out of the woodwork with options for credit recovery classes. That's when we really started digging in to using these programs. And so we have a very extensive credit recovery program here at Unit 5. Our students who fail a course we have basically four different sessions during the year: a fall, a spring, summer, and then we also have what we call our senior session, which is the second half of second semester for our seniors who we know aren't going to make it in one or more of their graduation requirements in that second semester, so that they can still meet graduation on time. And so for that, again, we have these forms. Now, I will say before I forget, our goal is to eventually turn all of these forms into actual online Google forms that can be easily filled out and tracked than paper downloads. That hasn't happened yet. Some of that is because we're waiting for approval for the board policies and for those things to be electronic. That's just a little bit of red tape. But so most of our students do the credit recovery using Edmentum, same program through Unit 5. Some of our students will actually fill this out and use it for Illinois virtual school classes. There are some through American School and a couple of other options that we've allowed students to do, but the majority of them do it through Edmentum because our staff is best able to support them that way. And for those of you not familiar with these online platforms, The reason we are able to use them for both credit recovery and for initial credit is because that's how these courses are designed by default. How it works is for each unit of a course, the student takes a pretest, and then based on how they do in each of the skills in that unit, they will exempt out of the activities and the assessments that they scored well on and be able to move through quickly. So theoretically speaking, a student who has sat through a semester of algebra, of seventh grade math, whatever it is, they should be able to do well on those pretests and move quickly through it as a credit recovery class. Whereas a student who is taking it as an initial credit, like they have a medical exemption and need this as part of their school day, maybe they're taking US history or world history or whatever it is, they won't be able to do well in the pretest because they've never seen the content. And so they are actually going to have to work through each of those activities and assessments, making it worth the full initial credit. So that's kind of the difference there. And then during our sessions, we do have, and I think we talk about this a little bit more later, but we do have staff members who are paid to be support systems and who organize and supervise this so that the students do have support and are not just on their own using the platform.
So we started with the boring form section of all of the planning, but we'll pause here for some questions. So Arlen, if there's anything in the chat or if anyone has their hand raised and they would like to ask some questions just about what we've shared so far.
All right, great. Nobody has shared anything in chat so far yet as far as questions. If you do have a question and would like to have the mic turned on for you and unmuted, just simply raise your hand using the raise hand icon at the lower right of your screen on Zoom, and we will unmute your mic and you can ask questions of Angie and Nikki. But I will continue to monitor chat and Q&A if you want to type your question in as well.
I would say we keep going then, and if anyone thinks of anything at any point, you can you'll also have our contact information, so if you have more specific questions about your own school or district, you can always send those to us also later if you think of things.
Okay, yeah, nothing in Q&A or chat, so you guys can go ahead and move on.
Okay. Are there people still with us? Did everybody leave or are they good? Okay.
Yeah, it looks like we're still 15 strong, so we're doing good.
All right, good. Okay, so we're on to the protocol. So this is kind of what it's going to look like. And so what is your virtual program going to look like as far as the protocols go? And I think Nikki mentioned this already. So kind of thinking about protocol, what are some things or policies maybe that you're going to have to review, modify, or implement? And so one thing Nikki mentioned already was Edmentum coordinators. And so one of the stakeholders that you're going to have to consider is support from your staff. And so this is what we use to support this, is that we use 3 Edmentum coordinator postings. And in our district, teachers teach 5 classes out of the 8 class periods a day. And so what we post this as is a 6th assignment. And so you can see some of the duties that we would require of this person and of this posting. We also post a separate one for credit recovery. And a typical caseload is that one Edmentum coordinator would have about 45 to 60 students, which could be anywhere from 80 to 100 courses that they're monitoring. And so that's the way that we would organize, I guess, the staffing for this and the postings that we would need for staff to help support our students in this. Now, this past year, I will tell you that we had to start the year. We added a 3rd, and then they had a very atypical caseload. Ours had about 180 courses each, just because of the pure amount of the need for not only initial credit, but also credit recovery and some creative things that we were trying to do as part of our MTSS support for students who just weren't engaging in school at all. And so our Edmentum coordinators were just a little burnout this year, which is definitely an overload. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing for that to help plan for the future too. One thing that we've learned a lot about is GPA and credit and what this looks like on a transcript. And so that's why we kind of geared this towards secondary. And so we wanted to gear it towards secondary because this is where we have to eventually put this on some kind of a record. And so I put our current board policy in there. And so ultimately we would decide if it counts toward a student's GPA. And so currently any class that is coded as a virtual class doesn't count toward GPA credit. Now it counts for credit. So if someone needs a PE credit or the US history credit, they're going to get the half credit toward that particular class toward graduation on their transcript. But we weren't awarding the GPA credit. And we actually in our district wouldn't award GPA credit for classes taken outside of Unit 5 as well. And so this is typically how we have handled that. So it could be a class that a student's taking at a junior college. It could be a class that a student's taking through Illinois Virtual School. It could be an in-house Edmentum virtual class like you see on this particular transcript piece here. And so you'll see that there is a 0 for the weight as far as the GPA credit goes. Another stakeholder that you're going to want to consider is your IT department. And so when you're thinking about protocols for this and what that looks like, we have to, when we do this, we had to create a whole course conversion code list. And so we were coming up with a system of only virtual classes and course codes that made sense for those. And so by involving IT, we have to, when a student is enrolled in one of these virtual courses, we have to put it into their schedule. By putting it in their schedule, it syncs then to Edmentum and syncs through Clever, which is the connection that our district uses. So kids can just log in and go in through Google and go into Edmentum, and then their courses are going to be there. So whatever course we put in here will sync, and then students will then show up in Edmentum. So if Maurer and I never put a kid in a virtual class in our district, then they're never going to show up in Edmentum. And if there's a course that we're using for the first time, and it's not told to sync to Edmentum, but it's in our course master, then it's also not going to show up in Edmentum yet. So there's just a lot of communication with IT. So that's another stakeholder that you're going to want to consider when you're developing protocols for this. Anything to add on that one, Maurer?
No, and I think, well, maybe, I guess I would also just make sure that depending on who in your district handles things like state reporting, tracking for attendance and credits, that how you set up your program will align with however they want things reported. Because when you do enter these courses or student schedule or their attendance, whatever that might be, this can trigger errors on those reports depending on how you set it up. So that's just something to consider so that you haven't set up a whole program and get to that reporting time of the year and then have to fix or redo everything instead of just being able to enter all of that the way it needs to be from the beginning.
And we'll talk about this a little bit later. Maurer brings up a good point, is when we put these in a student schedule, if we put virtual English 1, semester 1, we would also co-enter for that same hour, like a study hall, typically. And so these are marked as state exclude. And so then we're taking attendance for that study hall. And then these virtual classes wouldn't necessarily have the attendance linked to it. So then they can be marked as state exclude. Another stakeholder are outside organizations that you're going to want to consider. And so when we were planning for this, I don't know if this happened at other secondary schools, but NCAA eligibility came into play. And so it was something that we wanted to make sure that we were accounting for, because we didn't want to enroll a student in a virtual class for initial credit, for a medical PE situation, for credit recovery during the school day. and not have something linked to where it counts for NCAA. So we don't want to have an athlete in this and then all of a sudden it's not approved by the NCAA clearinghouse. And so this is something else just to consider. So here's our understanding of how the NCAA piece works after working through this and reading some of their guidance, is that if you were going to keep students in just an English 1 class, but you were going to have an online full remote teacher for that course, you could use the Edmentum platform, but you would want to make a separate section where there's a teacher for that particular course. And because the English 1 class is approved, you can use this as you could use Edmentum as your platform for teaching that class as long as it's with one of your teachers. However, as soon as we would enroll a student in virtual English 1 with a different course code, not NCAA approved and taught by one of our Edmentum coordinators, then it is no longer NCAA approved. So that gets a little confusing. So if that's something we need to touch base on after this and you are interested in implementing an online virtual program and you want to talk through the NCAA piece, we have been through that. We think we understand it in that fashion, that there's certain course codes in courses that are approved, but as soon as it says virtual and is taught by an Edmentum coordinator or someone that's not certified necessarily to teach that particular course, like your English 1 teacher typically would teach it, then it would no longer follow the clearinghouse guidelines. So if anyone has any information on that to share in the chat or anything that they've learned in dealing with anything NCAA clearinghouse wise, we'd love to hear it too. It's just something that we're continuously working through and trying to be mindful of for our athletes. There's some more stakeholders here with athletic eligibility, and when a student has a virtual class in their schedule and it's one of their up to 7 classes that they can take during their school day here with us, what we ran into is sometimes it's one of their classes that we have to count for eligibility. And so because Edmentum is a self-paced online platform, it doesn't fall, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it doesn't fall into our Infinite Campus gradebook, which is our student information system that we use. So Infinite Campus is what we use to communicate with parents and students and grades and attendance. And so in working through this, we had to come up with some criteria of if a student is in an Edmentum class, what do they have to be doing to show that they're passing the class? And so if you've ever worked with Edmentum, students, the way that Edmentum has, it has 2 separate grades, and you'll see this on a report in a little bit. It has a grade where whatever they've completed right now is graded, so they could have a 43% for their current grade, but then their course grade might be an A, because everything that they've completed so far is A work, but the current grade is a 43% because everything that they haven't completed yet turns to a 0 to reflect where they are currently. There's also an on pace or off pace communication that we would need for eligibility. And so you'll see this on a spreadsheet later. But this is something that we were just mindful of this year with the higher use of Edmentum classes during the school day because of the remote year and the COVID year and all of the situations we had. We wanted to make sure we were being mindful and consistent with eligibility as well for athletics. All right, so that was protocol. If there's any questions in the chat, we can follow up with anything we've talked about so far that would have to do with reviewing your policies or other things or other stakeholders that you'd want to consider in setting up your virtual program.
Okay, no questions have come into Q&A or chat yet. Feel free to type away. We'll give you a few seconds to get that in, or if you'd like to speak on the microphone, simply raise your hand with the button at the bottom, and we will turn your microphone on so you can ask Angie and Nikki questions directly.
Okay, well, again, if anyone has individual questions or things you think of later, don't hesitate to let us know. All right, so moving on to procedures, we've touched upon each of these in the different setup sections of it. So we'll move into a little bit more specific detail. When we are looking at our initial credit approval, so that is, the student has never taken this course before, they are getting the full credit and working through the entire course. We have several levels of approval for this. Angie kind of mentioned the main reason earlier is that the purpose of doing this in our district is not to replace classroom teachers, not to replace full sections of courses in our buildings. It's really for specialized situations for students, not for large groups of students. And so in order to make sure that we're using those checks and balances, we have different people that are part of that approval process. For us, the starting point is usually the counselor of that particular student. And then those come to either Angie or I, depending on the building. And we usually double check and make sure that they haven't already received credit sometime along the way for that course, because obviously we can't award credit twice. Checking that it fits within the student's 4-year plan and what they need towards graduation. And then from there, it goes to someone at our district level for approval. You can see Angie's screenshot because we have different organizational methods for this, but Dan L in this screenshot is our director of secondary ed. So for any general request, that's for a student that's part of our MTSS program, or just different situations, like I mentioned, the consumer ed, they just need the graduation requirement and it didn't fit in their schedule. Those would go to him. If we have specialty situations where it is a student with a 504 or an IEP, then those go to Melanie because she is the district administrator in charge of that. So she can make sure that any legalities, any issues with their plans, making sure that those are still met through this course happens. And then we keep those organized based on whether or not those were approved in order to know that we can move forward. And then from there, that information, once it's approved, is sent out to the student and the parent so that they know how to get started and what that support system looks like for them. Oh, the IC code. Okay, I see the
and
going
recently
back real quick.
also,
Go ahead, Ange. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say recently I've been starting to include our registrar as well, just in some of that communication when the form is reshared back with our Edmentum coordinator, because eventually at the end of all of this, your registrar is another stakeholder that you're going to want to include, is because there's a lot of grade reports to enter in all of that. And so you just want to keep them in the loop as well about why, we want to match what forms were turned in, what forms were approved, what's actually in their schedule, and then what grade reports actually come in. And so there's a big checks and balances that our registrars have been amazing with and trying to help with that and that piece. So that's just another stakeholder that I was reminded of as Maurer was going through the process.
Really quickly, I'm going to pause and go to one of the questions in the chat about the IC codes. So yeah. Infinite Campus is our SIS system. So different districts use different ones. So Infinite Campus is what we use. So that's what that's for. The course code itself, like MATV012, those Angie and I created to keep those all straight. We added the V to whatever our typical course code would be for that course in that department to signify that it's virtual versus a regular course. However, when you mention state coding, within that course, in the details within the SIS system, we do attach the correct state course code based on those state codes into the system as well. So they are linked to the state coding as well as just what we use in our system for our district courses. Hopefully that answers it. Okay, so then moving on to credit recovery approvals. That is a little bit more simple, luckily than the initial approval for full initial credit because the student has already failed our course. They're moving on to credit recovery because they've already taken the class here in one of our buildings. And so this doesn't go through the entire district level process of approval. We keep track of these in-house within our counseling department and our registrar. And we use similar spreadsheets to the ones that you can see there, so that all of the different stakeholders have access to that information, and we're housing it all in one file so that we can keep track of that throughout the entire process. Making sure that the student is in the correct course that matches what they failed, so they're not earning credit again for something they already have credit. Making sure, I mean, obviously depending on the semester. Right now in COVID world, we're offering all of this for free, but typically our credit recovery programs do cost money. And so keeping track of that, keeping track of contact information, keeping track of the grade that they've earned and if that's been entered onto their transcript. So really tracking all of that from the time that the student and the counselor turn in that form until the very end that we've earned or entered that credit into the system for them is important to keep track of all of that. But that one's a little bit easier. Progress tracking has evolved a lot. So and this even looks a little different even between our buildings, because it kind of really depends on who you hire or who is responsible, who your coordinators are, because there's going to be different things that they want to track or not. But the basics of this are the same. Making sure that we have a list of which students are taking which courses, whether that be for initial credit or credit recovery, doesn't matter. This is also like the master document where all of that pacing is kept track of throughout the time. And we are all on Google Suite, so that helps a lot because these spreadsheets are typically shared in Google so that all of the different stakeholders can see at any given time. So let's say a parent calls a counselor and says, how is my kid doing in their virtual class? The counselor can open this and it's updated several times a week by the coordinators and the teachers that are being paid to do that work. And so the counselor can say, oh, you know, that student's on pace, he's working towards his goals, and he's currently earning this percentage right now. And that really helps with the communication piece, because logging into the actual system and finding this information is not simple. And so keeping it organized this way is really helpful as well. You can see that we've also noted IEP and 504. We always include our case managers on this communication as well, because typically they tend to be the ones in closest contact with the student and the parent on a regular basis. And so that helps them as well, since this would be either part of their schedule or part of their goals towards graduation. And so it's important for those case managers to have that as well.
And typically this looks like a rainbow. So right now you'll see that this is from January. So it's all classes have been given grade reports, but typically this looks like a rainbow of all kinds of colors for the pacing. And so that way you can kind of tell where students are. So this is more of a finished one for the first semester when we close that out.
So for communication, our counselors here in our buildings are typically the front line of defense for all communication between the different coordinators, the parents, the student, making sure that everyone has what they need to make this a successful experience, whether it be credit recovery or initial. And then also making sure that the transcript is correct once all of this is done, because ultimately the reports that come out of this, at least at the high school level, very much have to be accurate, since those become permanent records for the students. And then, to be completely open and honest, there are still issues with Edmentum as far as the system they have in place within their online program for parent and student communication. It does not work the way we would like it to. And so our counselors have sort of had to bear a lot of the burden of that. Depending on the year and the semester, sometimes we have additional support with teaching assistants and paraprofessionals in our building that will be part of this process also, that can help with that. But what we have decided is we got permission to have a task force this summer, and part of that work is going to be trying to figure out how we can better communicate to the students and families throughout the process, how we can better streamline what all of our different codes and our different courses and how all of that is set up within both systems, our Infinite Campus district system and Edmentum, the online course program. So we really need to still, even though we've been doing this for a few years, still even streamline some of those things to make them more more applicable for everyone using them.
So that finishes up the procedures section. So if there are any questions on any of the procedural things that we've talked about, you could ask those now either in the chat or by raising your hand. Maurer, did you see anything else in the chat, or are we good to go?
No, I think we're good to move along. And again, just don't hesitate.
So one thing when Maurer and I were planning this was just talking about our fall 2021 and what that might look like and what is it going to look like maybe for you. So in our district with COVID related approvals, we do have a process for that. And so there will be certain approved medical situations where students would be able to enroll in our full Edmentum online program with the connection to maybe an Illinois virtual school class or maybe a connection to a Heartland class and help facilitate that. Our nurses in our district are anticipating that this might be less than 1% of our population of students. So we have about 13,000 students here. So we're anticipating less than maybe 130 students district-wide approved for this option. And so there are some other things that we have to consider with this. So this is our district approval form, and those were due, I think, a week ago or so. So they're probably reviewing those now. But one thing we had to consider from an online course option view is what are we going to be able to offer to a student who is medically approved, as a COVID related remote learning situation, not only through Edmentum, but also to try to help support if they had a dual credit class, or if there was a class that we're not offering through Edmentum, but Illinois Virtual School offers that. And so I'm not going to click on all of the links there, but these links will be available in the presentation as well. If you want that, we're happy to share that or email that out, or if maybe Arlen already does that. And so you'll be able to click on those and you'd be able to see how we correlate. So what is an Edmentum AP class in our course list? What's a dual credit class that we might be able to correlate to a Heartland class? And then what classes would we offer here in Unit 5 and offer a remote option through Illinois Virtual School? So those are just things that we've been considering and working on for these unique situations that we're still going to see in the fall.
And just to jump in really quickly, since we do have a wide range of people in different age groupings for schools, this plan, as far as using Edmentum for those medical approvals in our district, is going to be for students in grades 6 through 12, because the majority of courses offered through Edmentum are for that grade range. In our district is K-12 though, and for the elementary students, the plan is that they will be designating specific elementary teachers who will teach remote to students who are approved. They have to figure out the number of students, obviously, and figure out how many teachers they need for different grade level groupings. But that is the plan for elementary, because Edmentum does not work for elementary students. I'm not sure if there are any other solid online programs that could be used for elementary schools, but our district has decided to keep that teacher-based and teacher-driven instead of using an online platform for grades K through 5.
And so this is just the last piece of what Maurer already referenced, was in realizing the higher use of the Edmentum program in this past school year. We noticed some things that have come up from some feedback from our high users, like our Edmentum coordinators, our MTSS interventionists, our counselors, ourselves, Maurer and I as well, our credit recovery specialist. And so we have a complete task force request list that we made for our district and requested some time to revamp some things with the higher use and the more frequent use of Edmentum that we think need to be cleaned up now that we have some information to show and some data to show like this is what's needed. And so we've also connected with Edmentum and requested some things connected with our IT department. So we feel like we have the right next steps to move this forward. This has evolved, like Maurer said, and we just are continuously working on improving this for our district, for our students, for our families, for options, for all of these different uses that we've shared today.
Yeah, and I would
And
just
so
say
that would be our,
oh, sorry, Angela.
go ahead.
I would just say that my biggest suggestion, if you're thinking about implementing some of these things, is trying to outline who is going to be responsible for what, because as we plotted through this together, I mean, Angie and I are very fortunate that we have each other, you know, in sister schools to work together and kind of make it up as we go along. But it is a lot, and it can be very daunting to take this on. So especially if you are going to be the person implementing some of these things, making sure that you have the right supports around you to take on a lot of these tasks that we've outlined, because it can be overwhelming otherwise, trying to get it all done.
That ends the fall 2021. I don't know if there's any questions or about that specifically or anything with anyone wanting to raise their hand.
Although I do think your emoji choice, Angie, for this slide is perfect for how we're all feeling when we think towards the beginning of fall 2021. So.
Absolutely. Well, Angie and Nikki, thank you both so much for sharing with us today, all that you've learned and all that you've done with your virtual programs. We've got plenty of time for questions, so feel free to raise your hand. We want to thank our participants for joining us today as well. This was recorded, and I will be sending out a link tomorrow to access this recording, as well as a link to an evaluation that will, once completed, will give you the ISB evidence of completion form if you're an Illinois school educator. So you can get 1 PD clock hour for attending today's presentation. And Angie, you could also maybe send me a link to the slides so people could click on the links. That would be great. I'll include that in my email to the participants who made it and also those who weren't able to attend.
And I would say too, like, I am a big proponent of sharing. So please feel free to steal and take anything that is helpful for you. Do not start the wheel from scratch for yourself if you're doing this. Like, copy our forms, anything, because that's all of the busy work that takes up so much time and energy, that if anything that we have and that we're sharing through the links is helpful to you, please go ahead and use those and modify them to whatever works for you in your school or district.
And a lot of the links are going to be PDF files. And so if you need a Google Doc or you need it shared, there's an easy way that we can do that too. So the last slide, I think, will be Maurer and I's contact information again. So we'll make sure we get this to Arlen. One thing that we've been thinking about throughout the year is what's a challenge and what's an opportunity with this. And so just to wrap up today, if you wanted to share out or if you want to type in the chat or just as a reflection for yourself, maybe a challenge that you see in providing virtual programming to your students in your district. And then what do you see maybe as an opportunity for providing virtual programming to your students?
That would be great. Make sure you're in the to line you're sending to panelists and attendees so everybody can see your posts. And if not, we'll read them out loud. But that's great. We can kind of close out here with listing your challenges and opportunities.
funny that you mentioned Dan Zobel, because when we talked about IT, he is one of our main go-tos, because he was the person who helped us implement all of this through Clever and Edmentum. So he and Angie and I have spent lots of time together. One thing that I'll just share out as a very last thing when I think about the challenges and opportunities, that although it is time consuming, and there are a lot of different steps that can come into play, I think that the opportunity for some of our students that in the past have just been forced to struggle through whatever their life situations are, that we have another option for students to be successful and earn credit. That's huge. Not just COVID. I mean, not even just COVID related. It can be any number of things. I just think it's great that there are different things that we can do to help our students during challenging times, because their lives are just not always easy, and it's not always possible for them to spend 8 hours physically here in our school building every day for however many years. So that has been really great for several of our students over the past couple of years.
If there are no further questions for Angie or Nikki, I'm going to end the recording for us now.